Hello, good evening and welcome. This is Vantage Point. I'm Nadim Majid and joining us once again is Dr. Dayan Jayatilleka. Dr. Jayatilleka, thank you once again for being with us. I'd like to start off. The country is at a critical juncture at the moment. We're facing an election. It's a provincial council election, but it could prove to be as important, if not more important, than the last general election that we had. The reason is that after more than 2 decades, we're going to have a northern provincial council election. Dr. Jayatilleka, I'd like to start off with the run-up to this election. How have you seen the run-up to this election? Do you think it's a free and fair election? Not just the northern province, but all three.
Well, yes. I mean, that's the short answer. It's noteworthy that in the north, since 2010, it is the TNA that has prevailed electorally. This is despite the heavy military presence. So the only conclusion that I can arrive at is that whatever else the military is doing there, it has not been stuffing ballot boxes. I mean, not to any significant degree. And this is something that one can take some satisfaction and comfort in. So yes, I think it's a free and fair election. I'm familiar with the criticisms made by the main opposition party that they have no faith in elections because the 17th Amendment was repealed, and therefore that in the absence of independent commission, an independent public service really, that all elections are foreordained to be flawed or rigged or whatever. Now I have a problem with that. I'm for the 17th Amendment. I'm not happy about the 18th Amendment and the removal of term limits, but we've been having elections since 1972 without the 17th Amendment. We had an independent Public Services Commission right up to 1972, and then it was abolished by Madam Bandaranaike's government. So we've not had elections under anything like a 17th Amendment. We've had this increasingly politicized public service. It is probably now worse than it has ever been. But it has been this way pretty much since 72, and we've had elections, we've had changes of government. The UNP won in 77 massively, despite the fact that there was no independent public service. And Chandrika Bandaranaike led the SLFP to victory in 94. So all of this has happened. The electoral pendulum has swung irrespective of the absence of an independent bureaucracy. So if the opposition is doing badly, I am really not convinced that that's because there's no 17th Amendment. And in any case, how do they propose to bring back the 17th Amendment? I mean, obviously the government isn't going to, because the government is quite happy without it. So if one is to reinstate the 17th Amendment, you've got to actually win an election, come into Parliament with a majority, and then bring it back in. So this is circular argumentation. I don't think it's going to have more or less free and fair. That's the way I see it.
Dr. Jayatilleka, now in the run-up to these elections, we've seen a lot of controversies arising, especially around another constitutional amendment, probably the far more controversial 13th Amendment to the Constitution. We saw the Parliamentary Select Committee that was appointed to amend the 13th Amendment, although that's not in the title. It is, I guess, more or less what they're doing is looking at ways to amend the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. And very recently we saw the JHU pulling out of that process. Do you think that this is going to have an impact ahead of the provincial council elections?
Well, it's commendable that President Rajapaksa, probably for entirely pragmatic rather than idealistic reasons, chose to hold the Northern Provincial Council election before the Parliamentary Select Committee could deliberate on dismantling the 13th Amendment. So he's having this election under the 13th Amendment as it stands, in the face of considerable criticism and opposition, including from within his own governing coalition and even the power structure. I mean,
I think that most of the criticism is coming from within the UPFA itself, from within.
Well, it's not just within the UPFA; it's much closer home than that, I believe. So, despite that, he's had this election. Now, it may be because of the blandishments of Japan and a stick wielded by India. Whatever it is, he decided to go ahead and have this. Now, it took a lot of effort. Japan, India, a caucus within the UPFA fighting to preserve the 13th Amendment, battles in society, ideological battles, battle of ideas. I mean, I was part of some of those polemics. And it is therefore quite dismaying that the TNA has shown an increasingly immoderate political behavior in the last weeks of this election.
In the last weeks of this election, the manifesto, I mean, the TNA is easily the most powerful political party.
Certainly.
In terms of voter base in the northern province, most probably assured of victory in the northern province. I'd like to get to the TNA's manifesto ahead of the election. I mean, with victory almost assured, the TNA comes up with this document that has got a few people thinking and that has rattled a few people as well. What are your opinions on the TNA's manifesto?
Well, it's a strange manifesto. The TNA knows that it wasn't easy to get to this point, to have this election, and that it's treading on very thin ice. I would have thought that the TNA would understand the size of the niche that is available and take a prudent stance which enables it to get in there and build itself up and build up the Tamil community at the local level. Now, there are others who have been in far worse situations who have been very smart and done just this. For instance, Sinn Féin, Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement. People forget that these were ex-guerrillas. The IRA guys, Martin McGuinness, Jerry Adams, they belong to a centuries-old tradition of republicanism. But they accepted a deal in which Britain is not a republic, it's a monarchy. It's not federal, it's unitary, at least it claims to be unitary. And the Sinn Féin, the IRA, actually agreed to work the system of devolution within a nominally unitary framework. It didn't call for an international inquiry on Bloody Sunday. So that's smart politics of an autonomist sort. The IRA even reached out to and sort of neutralized the Protestant hardliners. It has a very good relationship it had with the Labour government. Now the TNA, which doesn't really consist of ex-guerrillas, I mean there are one or two like Suresh, but it's a parliamentary party. I would have expected it to be far more mature and moderate than it has been.
But Dr. Jayatilleka, don't you think the TNA at the end of the day is also a mix-up of parties? It is also at the end of the day a coalition, and you can expect there to be fissures within the separate parties. Is this why we're seeing some mixed messages coming out of the Tamil National Alliance hierarchy?
This is one reason. I believe there's another. Now, let's forget what the singular hardliners are saying about the TNA manifesto, because they have a problem with federalism. They have a problem with anything a Tamil moderate would say, because that's a singular hawkish reaction. That's not the problem I have. It's entirely legitimate that the TNA should call for federalism, should want the full implementation of the 13th Amendment, should even call for a measure of self-rule, self-governance, self-administration, whatever. All that's fine. That's not the problem. The problem with the manifesto lies elsewhere. It lies in the entirely uncritical mention of the tigers in the manifesto, and it lies in the fuzzy way in which terms such as sovereignty and the right of self-determination have been used.
Now, I have a problem with the TNA's mention of the LTT in the manifesto. As you mentioned, it is not critical, it is entirely uncritical. Do you think it's strange, because this came about after Madam Pillai called the LTTE a murderous organization.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
so do you think it's strange for the TNA to align itself or to associate itself with the LTTE when the UN's human rights chief has very clearly disassociated herself with the LTTE?
Well, Nadeem, it is strange, but that's not what's strangest about it. What is the most bizarre is that every party which is a constituent party of the TNA has lost top leaders to the LTT's murderous, ruthless terrorism that Nabi Pillai talked about. Ms. Amithalingam, leader of the TULF, leader of the opposition in the Sri Lankan Parliament at one time. Mr. Yogeswaran, Member of Parliament, Mrs. Yogeswaran, his widow and mayoress of Jaffna, who never had a bodyguard with her. Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvan. These are the top-of-the-line Federal Party, among others, who were murdered by the Tigers under Prabhakaran's orders. The Tello, Sri Sabaratnam, the leader of the Tello, and many Tello activists burnt alive in the streets of Jaffna on the 30th of April 1986. The EPRLF of Suresh Premachandran, his friend, leader, Padmanabha, I remember Padmanabha and Suresh coming over to Peradeniya University to meet me in 1978. The entire Central Committee of the EPRLF murdered by the Tigers in Chennai. Suresh survived because he was, at that time he was a smoker, he went out for smoke. Now, for the TNA, firstly to mention the Tigers, they could have kept the Tigers out of it. I mean, they're going to win that election anyway. They don't need to mention the Tigers. Why did they mention the Tigers? Point one. Point two, why didn't they mention the Tigers in a balanced manner? I mean, they could have said, well, these guys at one time, they thought they were fighting for the Tamils, but no, it's an entirely uncritical mention. It is, in fact, an exculpation. It is a whitewash. What are the references to the Tigers? There are two. One reference is that because of lack of progress towards a political solution, the Tigers continued their armed struggle. Now that, I'm afraid, is...
That's actually, it's some would say it's quite farcical, because the Tigers themselves withdrew from numerous opportunities at reaching a political solution.
Absolutely. I mean, the 1987 Indo-Lanka Accord, the Provincial Council, which this is the first. Then the 14 rounds of negotiations with President Premadasa. Then the 42 letters exchanged between Chandrika and the Tigers, and Chandrika's Union of Regions packages of 95 and 97. The new constitution draft of 2000. All of that, I mean, these, the Mandala Munasinghe proposals of 1993. There was progress. The Tigers went back to war every time. Mahinda Rajapaksa had just been elected when they blew up a Navy bus or something, if I remember right. Lakshman Khadirgama was shot while the ceasefire was in effect. So it is a despicable lie, really, to say that the Tigers resumed armed struggle because there was no political progress. The second reference to the Tigers in the manifesto says that by 87 the LTT had emerged as the sole armed organization. Now, how did it emerge? It butchered everybody else. The TNA doesn't mention that at all. So, why the whitewash of the LTT? And now, the grotesque situation in which Justice Vigneswaran had called Prabhakaran a great hero and is not a terrorist. Now, this is somebody who presided over Prevention of Terrorism Act.
The thing with Justice Vigneswaran, his nomination as the TNA's chief ministerial candidate, to people who are unaware of the situation, came as a bit of a surprise. Actually, came to a bit of a surprise to most people. Former Supreme Court Justice C.V. Vigneswaran being nominated as the TNA's chief ministerial candidate. In the final weeks running up to the election, we've seen some very, very mixed messages coming out of Justice C.V. Vigneswaran. For example, his statements about Prabhakaran in Velvetithurai, and then his statements to the Hindu newspaper last week.
And then his recantation of the Hindus.
His recantation of it at a media
yesterday or something.
I mean, he actually